The silence was deafening, not the peaceful kind that settles over a house at midnight, but the hollow, aching quiet that fills every corner when hope has been systematically crushed. Marcus Richardson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a glittering maze of possibilities that felt impossibly distant from his reality. Behind him, spread across his mahogany desk, lay 10 manila folders, 10 different specialists, 10 failed attempts, 10 variations of the same devastating conclusion: your son may never speak. Before you continue with us on this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 7-year-old James Richardson existed in a world that made perfect sense to him, but remained completely inaccessible to everyone else. Autism had wrapped itself around his mind like a fortress, beautiful and intricate from the inside, but impenetrable to those who loved him most. While other children his age chatted endlessly about cartoons and playground adventures, James communicated through patterns that only he understood. He would arrange his toy cars in precise geometric formations, each placement deliberate and meaningful in ways that eluded even the most educated minds money could buy. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle at first that Marcus had convinced himself it was temporary. James had spoken his first words right on schedule, maybe even early. Dada at 11 months, Mama at 13, more by his 2nd birthday. But somewhere between his 3rd and 4th year, the words began to fade like watercolors in rain. First the complex sentences disappeared, then the simple phrases, until finally even the single words became rare treasures, emerging only in moments of extreme distress or overwhelming joy. The Richardson mansion sat like a monument to success in the prestigious Brookhaven district, its Mediterranean architecture commanding respect from behind wrought-iron gates that might as well have been prison bars. Inside, 23 rooms echoed with the ghosts of conversations that would never happen. Marcus had built this empire from nothing, transforming a small construction business inherited from his late father into Richardson Global, a multi-billion-dollar development corporation that had reshaped skylines across 3 continents. Every achievement had been measured in square footage and profit margins, quantifiable victories that made sense in a world where effort equaled results. But autism didn't follow business logic. It couldn't be negotiated with, restructured, or leveraged into compliance. It simply existed, beautiful and frustrating and completely indifferent to the size of Marcus's bank account or the power of his connections. The first specialist had been Dr. Patricia Henley, a developmental pediatrician with credentials that read like a medical hall of fame. She'd spent 3 hours with James, observing his interactions, documenting his behaviors, measuring his responses to various stimuli. Her diagnosis came with clinical precision, wrapped in gentle bedside manner: high-functioning autism with significant communication delays. Treatment would be long-term, she'd explained, requiring patience and realistic expectations. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral interventions. A comprehensive approach that might yield modest improvements over years, not months. Marcus had thanked her professionally and immediately scheduled appointments with 3 more specialists. Dr. Raymond Kim, a behavioral neurologist from Johns Hopkins, had flown in specifically to evaluate James. He'd brought cutting-edge assessment tools and decades of experience working with nonverbal children on the spectrum. His conclusion had been almost identical to Dr. Henley's, differing only in the specific therapeutic recommendations. Applied behavior analysis, he'd suggested, combined with augmentative communication devices. Progress would be slow and incremental. The 3rd specialist had been Dr. Sarah Okafor, whose research on autism and language development had been featured in prestigious journals worldwide. She'd spent a full day at the Richardson home, observing James in his natural environment, noting how he interacted with familiar objects and spaces. Her assessment had been thorough, compassionate, and devastatingly consistent with her predecessors. James was a bright child, she'd assured Marcus, with obvious intelligence shining through his non-verbal behaviors. But spoken language might never come naturally to him. Each subsequent evaluation had felt like a variation on the same crushing theme. Dr. Michael Foster, the speech-language pathologist, had worked with James for 6 weeks before gently suggesting that alternative communication methods might be more realistic goals. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the occupational therapist, had made remarkable progress with James's sensory integration issues, but had to admit that language remained stubbornly elusive. Dr. David Chen, the developmental psychologist, had created beautiful behavioral plans that helped James navigate daily routines, but couldn't unlock the words trapped inside his mind. By the time Dr. Amanda Torres, the 9th specialist, had completed her assessment, Marcus had begun to feel like he was trapped in some cosmic joke. Each expert brought new terminology, fresh perspectives, innovative approaches, but the fundamental reality never changed. James remained locked in his silent world, and no amount of money or expertise seemed capable of building a bridge to reach him. The 10th and final specialist had been Dr. Robert Steinberg, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. He'd worked with heads of state, Hollywood executives, tech billionaires. His waiting list was 2 years long, but Marcus's connections had secured an immediate consultation. Dr. Steinberg had arrived with an entourage of assistants and enough diagnostic equipment to stock a small clinic. His evaluation had been the most comprehensive yet, involving brain scans, genetic testing, comprehensive behavioral analysis, and detailed family history documentation. When preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Steinberg delivered his verdict 3 weeks later. Marcus had been sitting in the same chair where he now found himself, staring at the same city view, feeling the same crushing weight of helplessness. The doctor's words had been chosen carefully, delivered with the kind of practiced compassion that comes from years of shattering parental dreams. "Mr. Richardson," Dr. Steinberg had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on impossible cases, "your son is remarkably intelligent. His non-verbal problem-solving abilities are extraordinary. He processes visual information at a level that would impress graduate students. But language, particularly spoken language, appears to be neurologically inaccessible to him. We've exhausted every intervention protocol I know. At this point, I would recommend focusing on alternative communication strategies and accepting that traditional speech may not be in James's developmental future." The words had landed like physical blows. Marcus had built his entire identity around solving problems, overcoming obstacles, refusing to accept limitations. But here was a challenge that couldn't be conquered through determination or resources. Here was a wall that money couldn't scale and influence couldn't demolish. That had been 3 months ago. Since then, the house had settled into a routine that felt more like an elaborate dance around disappointment. James attended a specialized private school designed for children with autism, where dedicated teachers worked patiently with alternative communication methods. He had picture cards, tablet-based communication apps, sign language lessons. He could express basic needs and wants through these systems, could even demonstrate complex understanding of abstract concepts. But his voice remained sealed away, accessible to no one. Marcus had thrown himself into work with renewed intensity, as if expanding Richardson Global's portfolio could somehow compensate for his inability to reach his own son. Board meetings ran later, business trips stretched longer, conference calls filled the spaces between sleep and consciousness. The penthouse office became a sanctuary where problems had solutions and challenges yielded to strategy. But every evening, he returned to the mansion in Brookhaven, where the silence waited for him like a patient predator. James would be in his room, usually arranging something in patterns that made perfect sense to his unique mind. Sometimes it was books, organized by color and size in complex formations that would have impressed architects. Other times, it was building blocks, constructed into elaborate structures that followed mathematical principles Marcus couldn't begin to understand. The boy's intelligence was obvious, blazing bright in everything he touched, but it remained locked behind a barrier that the world's best medical minds couldn't breach. The household staff moved through their routines with professional efficiency, maintaining the illusion that this was a normal home where normal conversations happened. Mrs. Patterson, the longtime housekeeper, had been with the family since before James was born. She remembered when the boy had babbled constantly, filling rooms with the kind of joyful noise that parents usually complain about but secretly treasure. Now she dusted around his silence, organized toys that were never scattered in the chaotic way most children's playthings should be. Thomas, the estate manager, coordinated the endless parade of therapeutic appointments, educational consultations, and medical evaluations that had become the rhythm of their lives. His calendar was color-coded, blue for speech therapy sessions that yielded no speech, green for occupational therapy that helped with everything, except the one thing Marcus most desperately wanted. Red for medical appointments that confirmed what everyone already knew, but no one wanted to accept. The kitchen staff prepared meals that James would eat only if they met his specific sensory requirements. No foods that touched each other, no unexpected textures, no unfamiliar seasonings. They'd learned to accommodate his needs without comment, understanding that routine was the scaffolding that held his world together. But even they noticed how quiet mealtimes had become, how the dining room that should have been filled with a child's chatter felt more like a library than the heart of a home. Marcus's sister Rachel visited monthly, bringing her own 2 children who bounded through the house like pinballs, their constant noise a stark contrast to James's careful quietude. Her kids adored their cousin, seemed to understand intuitively how to play alongside him without requiring verbal interaction. They would build block cities together, create elaborate train track configurations, engage in complex games that needed no words. But when they left, taking their laughter and chatter with them, the silence that remained felt even more profound. The hardest moments came at bedtime, when Marcus would sit beside James's bed and read stories aloud, knowing that his son understood every word, could follow complex narratives, could even demonstrate comprehension through gestures and expressions. But the goodnight kiss was always followed by the same crushing silence, the absence of "I love you too, Dad," echoing louder than any sound. Sleep had become elusive for Marcus, filled with dreams where James spoke in full sentences, where they had the kinds of conversations fathers and sons were supposed to have. He dreamed of baseball games where James cheered from the stands, of homework help sessions filled with questions and explanations, of teenage years that would bring the universal parental complaint of wishing the kid would just be quiet for 5 minutes. But he always woke to the same reality, a brilliant, beautiful, unreachable child who lived behind a wall of silence that no amount of love or money or expertise could demolish. The business continued to thrive, almost mockingly so. Richardson Global had just secured the largest commercial development contract in company history, a mixed-use complex that would transform an entire downtown district. The financial press had declared Marcus a visionary, a man who could see potential where others saw only obstacles. Magazine profiles painted him as a master strategist who turned every challenge into opportunity. If only they knew that the one challenge that mattered most remained utterly beyond his capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could envision the future of entire city blocks, could orchestrate construction projects that required coordinating hundreds of workers and millions of dollars in materials, could negotiate deals that required reading the subtlest cues in boardroom body language. But he couldn't understand why his own child arranged toy dinosaurs in specific sequences, couldn't decode the meaning behind the hand flapping that seemed to express emotions too complex for words. and couldn't bridge the gap between his love and his son's locked-away voice. The mansion had become a museum of abandoned hopes. The playroom still held the interactive toys that were supposed to encourage verbal play. The bookshelf was lined with guides to autism, communication disorders, childhood development, each one offering theories and techniques that had ultimately failed. Medical reports accumulated in filing cabinets like archaeological layers, documenting the steady erosion of optimism through clinical language and statistical probabilities. But James himself remained unchanged by the parade of experts and the weight of expectations. He moved through his days with a calm purposefulness that Marcus had learned to admire even as it broke his heart. The boy had created his own systems for navigating the world, his own methods of finding joy and comfort and meaning. He would spend hours watching the patterns of light that filtered through the stained glass windows in the front hall, his face reflecting a contentment that needed no words to explain. He found fascination in the mechanical precision of the grandfather clock in the foyer, standing motionless for minutes at a time as he absorbed the rhythm of its movements. Sometimes Marcus would catch glimpses of the person his son was becoming, independent of the labels and limitations that others had assigned to him. James had an artistic eye that expressed itself through the careful arrangement of objects, creating compositions that were undeniably beautiful, even if their logic remained mysterious. He demonstrated kindness toward animals that seemed almost telepathic, understanding their needs and moods in ways that required no verbal communication. He showed problem-solving abilities that suggested a mind working at levels that conventional testing couldn't measure. But none of these qualities could fill the aching void where conversation should have lived. Marcus would watch other fathers and sons at restaurants, observing the easy back and forth of questions and answers, complaints and reassurances. The mundane exchanges that built relationships one word at a time. He envied the parents who took their children's chatter for granted, who sometimes had to ask for 5 minutes of quiet to finish their own thoughts. The search for solutions had consumed nearly 2 years of their lives, not counting the initial period when Marcus had convinced himself that James was just a late talker, that the words would come naturally when he was ready. Even now, he sometimes caught himself listening for sounds that never came, hoping that today might be the day when breakthrough finally arrived. The 10th specialist's report remained in its manila folder on Marcus's desk, stamped with official letterhead that carried the weight of finality. But finality was a concept that Marcus had never accepted in business, and he wasn't ready to accept it in this most important of all his endeavors. Somewhere out there had to be an 11th opinion, a different perspective, an approach that hadn't been tried. The world was full of stories about medical miracles, unexpected breakthroughs, unconventional treatments that succeeded where traditional methods failed. As afternoon light slanted through the office windows, casting geometric shadows across the expensive carpet, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed absurd to anyone who knew him. He would step back from the expert opinions and the clinical assessments and the statistical probabilities. He would stop looking for the next specialist to add to his collection of failed attempts. Instead, he would focus on creating an environment where James could simply exist as himself, without the pressure of therapeutic goals or developmental milestones. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying. It meant accepting that his son might never speak, might never engage in the kinds of conversations that Marcus had imagined since the day James was born. But it also meant honoring the person James already was, rather than mourning the person he might never become. It meant learning to find connection through the languages James already spoke, through touch and presence and the subtle communications that existed beyond words. The house would need changes, modifications that prioritized James's actual needs rather than the theoretical needs identified by various therapeutic approaches. The staff would need different training, focused on supporting James's unique way of experiencing the world rather than trying to change it. Most importantly, Marcus would need to learn a different kind of fatherhood, one that didn't depend on traditional measures of success or conventional definitions of progress. But even as he made this resolution, a small part of him continued to hope. Hope was a stubborn thing, resistant to expert opinions and statistical realities. It lived in the spaces between certainty and despair, feeding on the smallest gestures and the briefest moments of connection. And tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new people, new chances for the breakthrough that everyone said was impossible, but that his father's heart refused to stop expecting. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk as Marcus finally left his office, carrying the weight of 10 failed attempts and the fragile flame of a hope that refused to be extinguished. At home, James would be finishing his dinner, probably arranging the remaining food into patterns that made sense only to him. There would be no excited recounting of the day's events, no questions about plans for tomorrow, no complaints about homework or requests for bedtime stories. But there would be James himself, brilliant and beautiful and impossibly dear, existing in his own perfect completeness, even as the silence continued to echo through the rooms of their too-quiet home. And maybe, Marcus thought as he drove through the darkening streets toward Brookhaven, maybe that would have to be enough, at least until the right person came along to prove that hope, however stubborn and irrational, sometimes knew things that expertise couldn't measure. Isabella Martinez had cleaned houses for 15 years, but she had never walked through a front door that felt so heavy with unspoken grief. The Richardson estate loomed before her like something from an architectural magazine, all soaring ceilings and pristine surfaces that seemed to whisper warnings about disturbing their perfection. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, had given her the tour with crisp efficiency, outlining duties that sounded straightforward enough. Dust the formal rooms, maintain the guest quarters, assist with laundry as needed. What Mrs. Patterson hadn't mentioned was the way silence lived in every corner of this place, thick and deliberate and almost alive. The job had come through an agency Isabella had worked with before, though the circumstances were unusual. Apparently, their previous cleaning service had abruptly terminated their contract after one of their staff members had what Mrs. Patterson delicately referred to as an incident with the family's son. No details were provided, just a vague reference to someone being unprepared for the boy's special needs and a stern warning that this position required exceptional discretion and patience. Isabella had nodded and accepted the assignment without much thought. Special needs children weren't foreign to her. Her own nephew Diego lived with cerebral palsy, and her neighbor's daughter had Down syndrome. She understood that some kids experienced the world differently, needed more time, required gentler approaches. What she hadn't expected was the profound quiet that seemed to emanate from every room, as if the entire house was holding its breath. On her third day, she encountered James for the first time. She was dusting the built-in bookshelves in what Mrs. Patterson called the library when movement caught her peripheral vision. A small boy had entered the room, moving with the careful precision of someone much older than his apparent age. He couldn't have been more than 7, with dark hair that caught the light filtering through tall windows and eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. Isabella continued her work, aware of his presence, but not wanting to intrude on whatever had brought him to this space. She had learned long ago that children, especially shy ones, often warmed up better when adults didn't force interaction. But as she worked, she became conscious of being observed with an intensity that felt almost scientific. When she glanced over, James was sitting cross-legged on the oriental rug, surrounded by what appeared to be every throw pillow from the nearby furniture, arranging them in a complex pattern that seemed to follow some internal logic. The pillows were organized by color gradations, creating a spectrum that flowed from deep burgundy through various shades of gold and cream to pale ivory. But it wasn't random. Each pillow's position seemed calculated according to size and texture as well as hue. creating a mandala-like formation that was undeniably beautiful even if its purpose remained mysterious. Isabella found herself pausing in her dusting, genuinely impressed by the artistry of the arrangement. "That's really something," she said softly, not expecting a response, but wanting to acknowledge the obvious care that had gone into the creation. James looked up at her then, and Isabella was struck by the depth of intelligence in his gaze. There was no confusion there, no vacancy that sometimes accompanied developmental delays. Instead, she saw a mind that was clearly working, processing, evaluating. He held her eyes for a moment that felt significant, then returned to his pillows, making a minute adjustment to one of the cream-colored ones. Isabella finished her dusting and moved on to other rooms, but the encounter stayed with her. There had been something in that brief exchange, a quality of attention that suggested James was far more aware of his surroundings than anyone might expect. Over the following days, she began to notice him more frequently, always engaged in some form of organizing or arranging activity that displayed the same careful attention to pattern and order. In the formal dining room, she found him creating geometric designs with the cloth napkins, each fold precise and deliberate. In the sunroom, he arranged potted plants according to height and bloom color, creating a display that looked almost professionally landscaped. Each activity was conducted in complete silence, but Isabella was beginning to understand that silence didn't necessarily mean absence of communication. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, in her careful way, that James didn't speak. The information was delivered as a practical matter, something Isabella needed to know for household management purposes. Don't expect verbal responses, she'd been told. Don't be alarmed by his behaviors. Don't take it personally if he doesn't acknowledge your presence. The warnings felt like armor, protective barriers meant to prevent disappointment or misunderstanding. But Isabella found herself curious rather than deterred. In her experience, people communicated in countless ways beyond words. Her grandmother had spoken 3 languages fluently, but had expressed her deepest love through food, spending hours in the kitchen creating meals that carried messages no words could contain. Her nephew Diego couldn't walk or speak clearly, but his laughter could fill a room with more joy than most conversations ever achieved. James's careful arrangement seemed like another form of language, one that required different kinds of listening. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came during Isabella's second week. She was cleaning the main floor guest bathroom when she heard what sounded like distress coming from the adjacent sitting room. Not crying exactly, but a series of sounds that conveyed frustration or upset. She found James sitting on the floor, surrounded by what appeared to be the contents of a jigsaw puzzle, but the pieces were scattered in obvious disarray rather than arranged in his usual precise patterns. Isabella could see immediately what had happened. Someone, probably one of the other staff members trying to be helpful, had attempted to work on the puzzle. Several pieces had been forced into obviously wrong positions, creating a jumbled mess that violated every principle of order that seemed so important to James. His small hands were moving frantically, trying to separate the incorrectly connected pieces, but his efforts were only making the tangle worse. "Oh, honey," Isabella said softly, settling herself on the floor beside him. "Somebody made quite a mess here, didn't they?" James looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of frustration and something that might have been hope. Isabella reached out slowly, telegraphing her intentions, and gently began separating the forced-together pieces. James watched her movements with laser focus, and she found herself narrating what she was doing in soft, steady tones. "See, this piece has too much sky blue to go in the corner where someone tried to put it. And this one with the tree branch, it wants to be over here where the colors match up properly. Puzzles are like stories, aren't they? Every piece has its right place, its proper part of the picture." As she worked, James began reaching for specific pieces, not randomly, but with clear intention. When Isabella sorted the edge pieces into a separate pile, he immediately understood the system and began contributing his own pieces to the appropriate categories. They worked together in comfortable silence, 2 people speaking the same language of order and purpose. The puzzle was large and complex, a reproduction of a Monet garden scene with subtle color variations that made it genuinely challenging. But James demonstrated an ability to see pattern connections that amazed Isabella. He could identify where pieces belonged based on tiny color gradations or texture details that she would have missed entirely. His spatial reasoning was extraordinary, his visual processing skills obviously far above average. When they finally completed a substantial section of sky and garden backdrop, Isabella sat back and smiled at their handiwork. "We make a good team," she said, and for the first time since she'd started working at the Richardson house, she saw James smile back. Not a big smile, not the exuberant grin of a typical child, but a subtle expression of satisfaction and perhaps recognition that someone understood his way of engaging with the world. From that day forward, their relationship shifted into something Isabella hadn't expected when she'd taken the job. James began seeking her out, not in obvious ways, but through the kind of subtle positioning that children master when they want adult attention without asking for it directly. If she was cleaning the dining room, he would appear with a book, settling nearby to read silently while she worked. If she was in the kitchen helping with meal preparation, he would find reasons to pass through, sometimes stopping to observe whatever she was doing. Isabella began to understand that James was incredibly routine-oriented, not in the rigid way that some descriptions of autism suggested, but in a manner that provided him with structure and predictability in a world that often felt chaotic. He ate the same breakfast every morning, prepared in exactly the same way. His clothes were arranged in his closet according to a system that seemed to prioritize texture and color coordination over conventional organization. His toys and books were maintained in specific locations, and any disruption to these arrangements caused visible distress. Rather than viewing these patterns as limitations, Isabella began to see them as James's way of creating safety and control in his environment. She started incorporating respect for his systems into her own work routines, learning which items could be moved for cleaning and which needed to remain exactly in their designated positions. She discovered that James responded positively when she asked permission before disturbing his arrangements, even though he couldn't verbally grant or deny her requests. His body language and facial expressions provided clear guidance about what was acceptable and what caused anxiety. Marcus Richardson remained largely absent during Isabella's first month of employment. She caught glimpses of him occasionally, usually dressed in expensive suits and carrying the kind of purposeful energy that suggested important places to be and crucial decisions to make. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned that Mr. Richardson worked very long hours, that his business required extensive travel, that he was deeply committed to his professional responsibilities. The subtext seemed to be that James's care fell primarily to the household staff, with father and son operating in largely separate spheres. But Isabella began to notice things that suggested the separation wasn't as complete as it appeared. She found evidence of Marcus's presence in small details. A coffee cup left on James's bedside table, suggesting bedtime visits. Art supplies that appeared in the playroom overnight, as if someone was trying to encourage creative expression. Books added to James's collection that seemed chosen with specific care for his interests and reading level. The breakthrough that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late November. Isabella was in the main floor powder room, replacing towels and checking supplies, when she heard unfamiliar sounds coming from the hallway. Not James's usual quiet movements, but something that sounded like genuine distress. She found him in the front foyer, sitting on the marble floor beside the grandfather clock, rocking slightly and making soft humming sounds that conveyed obvious upset. Isabella approached carefully, settling herself at a respectful distance, and tried to understand what had triggered his distress. The clock was still running, its pendulum maintaining its steady rhythm, but something was clearly wrong from James's perspective. As she watched, she began to notice what he had noticed, The clock was running approximately 3 minutes slow compared to the digital display on the security panel near the front door. For most people, a 3-minute discrepancy would be barely noticeable and certainly not distressing. But for James, whose internal sense of order and precision governed his interaction with the world, the inconsistency was genuinely upsetting. Isabella could see him glancing back and forth between the two timepieces, his distress increasing as he processed the wrongness of the situation. "You notice the clocks don't match," Isabella said softly. "That would bother me too. When things are supposed to work together and they don't, it feels all mixed up inside." James looked at her with an expression that seemed to convey both surprise and relief that someone understood his concern. Isabella stood up and examined the grandfather clock more closely, looking for the mechanism that would allow minor adjustments. She'd grown up in a house with old mechanical clocks, and her father had taught her the basics of maintenance and regulation. "I think I can fix this," she said, opening the clock's case carefully. "Would you like to help me make sure it matches the other clock exactly?" What followed was one of the most focused collaborative efforts Isabella had ever experienced. James positioned himself where he could see both timepieces clearly, and through a combination of gestures and positioning, he helped guide her adjustments. When the clocks finally synchronized, displaying identical times to the second, his relief was palpable. But more than that, he looked at Isabella with something that felt like trust, recognition, that she understood his need for things to be correct and orderly. That evening, as Isabella was preparing to leave, she encountered Marcus Richardson for the first time since her initial hiring interview. He was standing in the kitchen, looking exhausted in a way that expensive clothes couldn't disguise, holding a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold. When he saw her, his expression shifted into the polite mask that wealthy people often wore when interacting with service staff. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the kind of distant courtesy that maintained appropriate boundaries. "I hope everything's going well. Mrs. Patterson tells me you're working out nicely." "Thank you, Mr. Richardson," Isabella replied. "James is a wonderful boy, very intelligent." Something flickered across Marcus's face at the mention of his son, a micro-expression that suggested both pride and pain. "Yes, he is. Different but brilliant in his own way." Isabella hesitated, aware that she was about to cross professional boundaries, but feeling compelled to share something that might matter. "He notices everything, the smallest details that most people would miss completely." This afternoon, he realized the grandfather clock was running slow before anyone else would have caught it. Marcus set down his coffee cup, his attention suddenly sharper. "The grandfather clock?" It was about 3 minutes off from the security panel display. James was upset by the inconsistency, so we fixed it together. He has an incredible sense of precision. For a moment Marcus was quiet, and Isabella wondered if she had overstepped. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, something warmer and more genuine than the polite distance he'd maintained before. "He used to love that clock when he was smaller," Marcus said quietly. "Before?" He paused, seeming to catch himself before revealing more than he'd intended. "I mean, he's always been drawn to mechanical things. Patterns, systems, the way things work together." Isabella nodded. "He sees connections that other people miss. It's like he understands languages that the rest of us are still learning to speak." The conversation might have ended there, with polite acknowledgements and appropriate boundaries maintained. But something in Marcus's expression suggested that Isabella's words had reached something deeper than professional courtesy. For the first time since she'd started working at the Richardson house, she sensed that she was talking to James's father rather than just her employer. "The specialists tell me he may never speak," Marcus said, the words emerging like a confession he hadn't intended to make. 10 different experts, all with the same conclusion. Isabella considered her response carefully, aware that she was being trusted with something significant. "Speaking isn't the only way to communicate," she said finally. "James tells me things every day, not with words, but with the way he sees the world, the patterns he creates, the problems he solves. Maybe the specialists are looking for the wrong kind of language. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Isabella's face as if trying to determine whether her words carried genuine insight or just well-meaning platitudes. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly and his expression softened. "You really think he's trying to communicate?" he asked. "I think he communicates constantly," Isabella replied, "just not in ways that most people recognize. But if you watch him, really watch him, you can see how much he's saying." That conversation marked a turning point, though Isabella didn't recognize its significance at the time. Over the following days, she began to notice Marcus's presence in the house more frequently. Not intrusive presence, but the kind of careful observation that suggested someone learning to see familiar things from new perspectives. She would catch glimpses of him watching James work on puzzles, or standing quietly in doorways while his son engaged in his careful arranging activities. James seemed to sense the increased attention as well, though his response was characteristically subtle. His positioning in common areas became more deliberate, as if he was unconsciously creating opportunities for observation. His activities took on a slightly performative quality, not showing off in the traditional sense, but demonstrating his capabilities in ways that couldn't be ignored. The real shift began when Marcus started joining their puzzle sessions. It happened gradually, almost accidentally at first. Isabella and James were working on a particularly challenging 1,000-piece landscape when Marcus appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand, clearly intending to pass through to somewhere else. But he paused, watching their collaborative process, and Isabella saw the exact moment when professional distance gave way to parental curiosity. "That's a difficult one," Marcus said, nodding toward the puzzle. "James has an incredible eye for it," Isabella replied. "He sees connections that I miss completely." As if to demonstrate her point, James reached across the partially completed puzzle and placed a piece that Isabella would never have thought belonged in that location. But when it clicked into place, it completed a section of cloudy sky that had been mystifying them both. "How did you know that went there?" Marcus asked, settling into a nearby chair without seeming to realize he was staying rather than passing through. James looked up at his father, and Isabella witnessed something she hadn't seen before, direct eye contact between them that lasted more than a fleeting moment. James pointed to the piece he'd just placed, then to adjacent pieces, his finger tracing connections that showed how subtle color variations and texture patterns had guided his choice. "He's showing you his thinking process," Isabella said softly. "How he reads the visual information to understand where pieces belong." Marcus leaned forward, studying the puzzle with new attention. "So it's not random. You're seeing patterns that tell you where things fit." James nodded, not enthusiastically but clearly, the first definitive response to a direct question that Isabella had witnessed. Marcus's intake of breath was audible, and she realized she was watching a father discover that communication with his son was possible, just not in the ways he'd expected. From that afternoon forward, puzzle time became family time, in ways that felt organic rather than forced. Marcus began joining them regularly, learning to read the subtle signals that James used to indicate preferences, frustrations, and satisfactions. Isabella found herself serving as translator at first, interpreting James's non-verbal communications for his father. But gradually, the need for interpretation decreased as Marcus developed his own understanding of his son's language. The changes extended beyond their shared activities. Marcus began modifying his work schedule, arriving home earlier and leaving later in the mornings. Not dramatically, but enough to create more opportunities for the kind of quiet presence that James seemed to crave. Isabella noticed that James's arrangements became more elaborate and artistic when his father was home, as if he was creating visual conversations intended for a specific audience. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The exhausted distance that had characterized his demeanor began giving way to something that looked like cautious hope. He asked Isabella questions about James's routines, his preferences, his unique ways of engaging with the world. Not clinical questions seeking solutions to problems, but genuine curiosity about who his son was, rather than what was wrong with him. "You've changed how he sees James," Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Isabella one afternoon. They were folding laundry together, a domestic task that had somehow become an opportunity for the kind of honest conversation that happened between women who shared the care of a household. "I don't think I changed anything," Isabella replied. "I just noticed what was already there." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's what he needed. Someone to see James clearly, without trying to fix him or change him. The observation stayed with Isabella as she continued her work, helping her understand that her role in the Richardson household was evolving into something beyond traditional domestic employment. She was becoming a bridge between father and son, facilitating connections that had always been possible but had been obscured by grief and misunderstanding and the well-meaning interference of experts who saw pathology where she saw difference. But the real transformation was still ahead of them, waiting in the quiet spaces between ordinary moments, preparing to emerge when the conditions were finally right for the miracle that everyone had stopped believing was possible. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows in geometric patterns that danced across the marble countertops, creating the kind of natural light display that James found endlessly fascinating. Isabella was preparing his breakfast with the ritualistic precision that had become second nature over the past 3 months. Whole grain toast, cut diagonally, strawberry preserves spread in a thin, even layer that reached exactly to the crust edges. Orange juice in his preferred blue cup filled to precisely the halfway mark. These weren't arbitrary preferences, but essential elements of James's morning routine, small consistencies that helped him navigate a world that often felt unpredictable and overwhelming. Marcus sat at the kitchen island, ostensibly reviewing emails on his tablet, but actually watching the careful choreography between Isabella and his son. The transformation in their household dynamics had been so gradual that he sometimes forgot how different things had been before Isabella arrived. James no longer retreated to his room immediately after breakfast, no longer moved through the house like a cautious visitor in his own home. Instead, he lingered in common areas, engaged in activities that seemed designed to create opportunities for interaction, even if that interaction remained largely non-verbal. This particular morning carried an unusual energy that Marcus couldn't quite identify. James seemed more alert than usual, his attention shifting frequently between his breakfast routine and the adults in the kitchen. His movements had a quality of anticipation, as if he was preparing for something specific to happen. Isabella appeared to sense it too, moving with even more deliberate care than usual, speaking in the soft, steady tones that had become their household's natural rhythm. "The light coming through the window is making rainbows on the counter," Isabella observed, noting how James's gaze had fixed on the prismatic effects created by the crystal fruit bowl. "Sometimes when the sun hits things just right, it breaks into all its different colors." James set down his toast and moved closer to the light display, his face reflecting the kind of focused fascination that Isabella had learned to recognize as his way of processing complex visual information. He reached out slowly, not quite touching the scattered light patterns, but tracing their shapes in the air with precise finger movements that suggested he was mapping their geometry in his mind. Marcus watched this interaction with the mixture of wonder and frustration that had become familiar to him. Wonder at the obvious intelligence and sensitivity that James demonstrated in these moments, frustration at his own inability to understand or participate in his son's unique way of experiencing the world. But Isabella had been teaching him, through patient example and gentle guidance, how to enter James's perceptual space without disturbing its delicate balance. "He's studying the angles," Marcus said, recognizing the mathematical quality of James's movements. "The way the light bends and separates." Isabella nodded, pleased that Marcus was learning to read the subtle indicators of his son's thinking processes. He sees patterns that most of us miss completely. The relationship between the light source and the surface, how movement changes the display. As if responding to their recognition of his analysis, James moved slightly to his left, and the light patterns shifted accordingly. His expression showed satisfaction with this cause and effect demonstration, and he repeated the movement several times, clearly enjoying his ability to manipulate the visual display through positioning. The ordinary moment might have continued in this comfortable pattern of observation and quiet interaction, but something unexpected intruded. The peaceful kitchen atmosphere was suddenly disrupted by the harsh electronic buzz of the security system's alert tone, followed immediately by Mrs. Patterson's voice over the intercom system, announcing that James's morning tutor had arrived earlier than scheduled. James's reaction was immediate and intense. His body tensed visibly. His hands moved from their graceful light tracing to anxious stimming patterns, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The comfortable routine had been disrupted, the predictable sequence of his morning thrown into disorder by this unexpected change in timing. Isabella recognized the signs of mounting distress and moved quickly to intervene before the situation escalated into a full meltdown. "Change is hard when you're expecting things to happen in a certain order," Isabella said, her voice maintaining its calm steadiness despite the obvious urgency of the situation. "Your tutor is here early and that feels all wrong because it's not the right time yet." James looked at her with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding, for someone to acknowledge that this disruption wasn't trivial but genuinely distressing. His hands were moving more frantically now, and Isabella could see that he was struggling to maintain emotional regulation in the face of this unexpected alteration to his carefully structured morning. Marcus started to stand, his instinct to take charge of the situation and somehow fix whatever was wrong. But Isabella caught his eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. She had learned that James responded better to calm presence than to adult anxiety, that rushing to solve problems often intensified rather than resolved his distress. "We can ask Mrs. Patterson to have your tutor wait in the library," Isabella continued, settling herself at James's eye level and speaking directly to him rather than about him. "That would give you time to finish your breakfast routine the right way, in the right order." But James's distress was escalating beyond the reach of reasonable solutions. His stimming had progressed to more obvious hand flapping, and Isabella could see the telltale signs of sensory overload beginning to manifest. The combination of unexpected schedule disruption, increased adult attention, and his own rising anxiety was creating a perfect storm of overwhelm that threatened to derail not just the morning, but potentially the entire day. It was then that Isabella made a decision that would change everything. Rather than continuing to offer verbal reassurance or practical solutions, she began to hum, not loudly or obtrusively, but in the same soft, steady tone she used for their conversations. The melody was simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic in its gentle persistence. It was a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her decades ago, passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes the most powerful communication happened through sound rather than words. The effect on James was remarkable. His frantic movements slowed, his breathing began to regulate, and his attention shifted from internal distress to external focus on Isabella's humming. She maintained the melody while slowly reaching out her hand, not to restrain or direct him, but simply to offer connection if he chose to accept it. James looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, then back at her hand. The decision-making process was visible in his expression, weighing options, assessing safety, determining whether this offered comfort or additional stress. Finally, slowly, he placed his small hand in hers. The moment their hands connected, something shifted in the kitchen atmosphere. The urgency drained away, replaced by the kind of focused calm that Isabella had learned to recognize as James's optimal state for processing complex situations. His grip on her hand was firm but not desperate, seeking grounding rather than rescue. "Better?" Isabella asked softly, and James nodded once clearly. But instead of the crisis passing, as they had all expected, James's expression became more intense. He was looking directly at Isabella now, with a focus that felt different from his usual careful observation. His free hand moved to his throat, pressing lightly against his neck in a gesture that Isabella had never seen him make before. "James?" Marcus said quietly, recognizing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. James opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. His brow furrowed with the kind of concentration that suggested enormous internal effort. His hand remained pressed against his throat, and Isabella began to understand that he was feeling for something, testing something, preparing for something that required physical as well as mental preparation. The silence in the kitchen became profound, not empty, but full of potential. Marcus found himself holding his breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Isabella continued her gentle humming, providing a steady auditory anchor, while James worked through whatever internal process was unfolding. Then, with effort that was visible in every line of his small body, James opened his mouth and spoke his first word in over 3 years. "Help." The word was quiet, slightly hoarse from disuse, but unmistakably clear. It hung in the kitchen air like something miraculous, something that belonged in the realm of impossible things that occasionally became possible through mysterious combinations of circumstance and care and love. Marcus's tablet clattered to the floor, forgotten completely as he stared at his son in shock and wonder. Isabella's humming stopped abruptly, her own eyes filling with tears as she recognized the magnitude of what had just occurred. But James himself seemed calmer now, as if the enormous effort of producing that single word had somehow resolved the internal pressure that had been building. "Did you just—" Marcus began, his voice breaking slightly. "Help," James repeated, this time looking directly at his father. The word was stronger now, more confident, as if the first attempt had been practice, and this was the real communication. Isabella squeezed James's hand gently. "You asked for help," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You used your voice to tell us what you needed." The implications of this moment were staggering. James had chosen to break years of silence, not to express joy or excitement or any of the positive emotions that therapists and specialists had hoped might motivate speech, but to ask for help. The word choice revealed so much about his internal experience, about the ways he had been struggling silently with challenges that no one had fully understood. Marcus rose from his stool and approached slowly, as if sudden movements might somehow undo the miracle he had just witnessed. "James, can you say it again? Can you tell me what kind of help you need?" James looked between his father and Isabella, processing the request, weighing whether he was ready for additional verbal communication. The effort required for speech was obvious in his expression, but so was his growing confidence in his ability to produce words when they were truly necessary. "Schedule," James said after a long moment, the word slightly less clear than help, but still completely understandable. "Wrong schedule." Isabella laughed softly, a sound that mixed joy with recognition of James's logical priorities. Even in this extraordinary moment, his primary concern remained the disruption to his morning routine. His first extended communication was entirely practical, focused on solving the problem that had triggered his distress in the first place. "You're right," Marcus said, kneeling down so he could meet James at eye level. "The schedule got messed up, and that's really frustrating. Should we fix it together?" James nodded, then looked at Isabella as if seeking confirmation that this plan made sense. When she smiled encouragingly, he seemed to relax further, his breathing returning to its normal rhythm. What followed was unlike any conversation Marcus had ever had with his son, primarily because it wasn't really a conversation in the traditional sense. James spoke sparingly, using single words or short phrases only when absolutely necessary to communicate essential information. But each word was chosen with obvious care, carrying more meaning than lengthy explanations might have conveyed. "Tutor waits," James said when Marcus asked how they should handle the early arrival. "Library better," he added when Isabella asked where the tutor should wait. "Finish breakfast first," he concluded when asked about his preferences for the morning's sequence. Each utterance was followed by long pauses, not uncomfortable silences, but thinking time that James needed to process the complex demands of verbal communication. Isabella and Marcus learned to wait patiently for his responses, understanding that this was an entirely new form of interaction for all of them. Mrs. Patterson was summoned to hear the miraculous development, and her reaction was everything Marcus could have hoped for. The usually composed housekeeper actually cried when James looked at her and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," in response to her amazed greeting. The formal politeness of the phrase was so characteristic of James's careful nature that it somehow made the miracle feel even more authentic. The tutor was indeed asked to wait in the library while James completed his breakfast routine, but the lesson that followed was unlike any they had experienced before. James began using single words to answer questions, to request clarification, to express preferences. His responses were minimal but unmistakably intentional, each word a deliberate choice to bridge the gap between his internal understanding and external communication. "More," he said, when asked if he wanted additional practice problems. "Different," he requested when presented with a math concept that didn't align with his preferred learning style. "Finished," he announced when he had completed the assigned tasks to his satisfaction. The tutor, an experienced professional who had worked with many nonverbal children, was visibly moved by James's sudden willingness to communicate. She had been working with him for months, using alternative communication methods, picture cards, and gesture systems, never expecting to hear his actual voice engaging with academic material. By lunchtime, word had spread through the household that James was speaking. Not constantly or extensively, but consistently when communication served a specific purpose. The staff who had known him throughout his silent years were stunned by the development, though Isabella noticed that their surprise carried undertones of relief, as if they had always suspected he had words trapped inside, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Marcus found himself struggling to process the emotional impact of the morning's events. The child he had been told might never speak was not only speaking, but demonstrating that his silence had never indicated lack of understanding or inability to communicate. James had been listening, learning, observing everything around him, while the adults in his life had debated his capabilities and limitations. The afternoon brought another significant development when James approached Isabella during her regular cleaning routine and said, "Thank you, Isabella." The formal politeness was characteristic of his communication style, but the content was emotionally profound. He had chosen to use his newly rediscovered voice to express gratitude to the person who had understood and supported him when he needed it most. Isabella's response was equally significant. Rather than making a big celebration of his words or treating them as miraculous, she simply replied, "You're welcome, James. Thank you for trusting me enough to ask for help." This matter-of-fact acceptance of his communication seemed to give James permission to continue exploring the possibilities of verbal expression. Throughout the afternoon, he added single words or short phrases to interactions that had previously been conducted entirely through gesture and observation. "Please," when he wanted assistance with a difficult puzzle section. "No, thank you," when offered a snack he didn't want. "Yes," when asked if he was ready for his afternoon art activity. Each word was carefully considered, economically used, but clearly intentional. James wasn't becoming a typical chatty 7-year-old overnight, but he was demonstrating that he had always possessed the capacity for verbal communication and had simply been waiting for the right circumstances to make it worthwhile. Marcus spent the afternoon alternating between euphoria and something approaching grief. The joy of hearing his son's voice was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by the realization of how much silent suffering James might have experienced during his non-verbal years. How many times had he needed help but been unable to ask for it directly? How many frustrations had built up because he lacked the words to express his needs clearly? But Isabella helped him understand that regret was less important than recognition. "He's been communicating with us all along," she pointed out during a quiet moment while James was napping. "We just had to learn his language. Now we have 2 languages to work with instead of 1. The evening brought perhaps the most significant moment of this extraordinary day. As bedtime approached, James found his father in the home office and stood quietly in the doorway until Marcus noticed his presence. "James, do you need something?" James approached slowly, his expression serious but not distressed. When he reached Marcus's chair, he placed one small hand on his father's arm and looked directly into his eyes. "Love you, Dad," he said clearly, using more words in a single utterance than he had managed since his silence began years earlier. Marcus felt something break open in his chest, some barrier that had been protecting him from the full intensity of hope and love and connection that parenthood demanded. He pulled James into his arms, holding him close while tears ran down his face unchecked. "I love you too, son," he whispered into James's dark hair. "So much. More than all the words in the world." James hugged him back, not with the desperate clinging of a child seeking comfort, but with the steady affection of someone who understood the significance of the moment and chose to fully participate in it. When bedtime stories resumed that night, they were different than they had ever been before. Marcus read as he always had, but now James occasionally interjected single words or short phrases. Again, when he wanted a passage repeated. Funny when something amused him. Sad when a story element touched his emotions. The responses were sparse but profound, providing Marcus with glimpses into his son's emotional and intellectual responses that had been hidden during the silent years. James wasn't just listening passively to stories. He was actively engaging with narrative elements, character motivations, plot developments. As Isabella prepared to leave that evening, both Marcus and James walked her to the door, a spontaneous escort that had never happened before. At the threshold, James looked up at her and said, "See you tomorrow, Isabella." The simple phrase carried enormous weight, not just because it demonstrated his growing comfort with verbal communication, but because it revealed his understanding of continuity, his expectation that the positive changes in his life would persist, that the people who mattered to him would continue to be present. "I'll see you tomorrow, James," Isabella replied. "Sweet dreams." As she drove home through the darkening streets, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary nature of what they had all witnessed. James's first word hadn't been "Mama" or "Dada" or any of the typical utterances that mark childhood milestones. Instead, he had chosen to break his silence with a request for help, demonstrating both his practical nature and his growing trust in the adults around him. The medical experts who had declared speech unlikely or impossible would need to revise their assessments, but Isabella understood that the real miracle wasn't neurological or developmental. It was relational. James had begun speaking not because his brain had suddenly changed, but because his environment had become safe enough, understanding enough, patient enough to make verbal communication worth the enormous effort it required. Back at the Richardson house, Marcus sat beside James's bed long after the boy had fallen asleep, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing and marveling at the day's transformations. The silence that had defined their relationship for so long would never return completely, but it would never again feel like a barrier. They had discovered that love could exist perfectly well without words. But having both love and words felt like an embarrassment of riches, a gift that would reshape their lives in ways he was only beginning to imagine. The first word had been help, but Marcus understood that it represented the beginning of countless conversations yet to come. Questions about the world, expressions of preference and opinion, sharing of thoughts and dreams that had been locked away during the silent years. James had always been a complete person. Now he had additional tools for sharing that completeness with the people who loved him. The miracle wasn't that a non-verbal child had begun to speak. The miracle was that a family had learned to hear each other across all the different languages of love and connection and understanding that exist between human beings. Words were just one of those languages, beautiful and useful but not more essential than presence, patience, and the kind of attention that sees the whole person rather than just the behaviors that fit conventional expectations. Tomorrow would bring new words, new conversations, new opportunities to understand the remarkable mind and heart that James had always possessed. But tonight, in the quiet of his son's peaceful sleep, Marcus simply listened to the sound of breathing and felt grateful for all the different ways that love could express itself, with words and without them, in silence and in speech, in the ordinary moments that sometimes revealed themselves to be extraordinary beyond measure. 6 months had passed since James spoke his first word, and the Richardson household had transformed in ways that no amount of money or expert intervention could have predicted. The mansion that once echoed with silence now hummed with the subtle sounds of genuine communication. James's carefully chosen words interspersed with comfortable quiet, conversations that happened as much through gesture and expression as through speech, and the kind of easy companionship that develops when people truly understand each other's languages. Isabella had become far more than a maid in the conventional sense. Her role had evolved organically into something that defied traditional job descriptions, part family coordinator, part communication bridge, part trusted confidant who understood the delicate dynamics that made their unconventional family unit function so effectively. Marcus had officially changed her title to Family Support Coordinator, with a salary that reflected both her importance to their lives and his deep gratitude for her transformative presence. The change in James was remarkable, not just in terms of his increasing verbal communication, but in his overall engagement with the world around him. He still preferred routine and predictability, still found comfort in organizing and arranging objects according to his own internal logic, but these characteristics no longer felt like limitations. Instead, they had become appreciated aspects of his unique personality, strengths that brought order and beauty to their shared spaces. His vocabulary had expanded steadily but thoughtfully. James didn't chatter aimlessly like some children his age, but he used words with increasing precision and confidence when they served his purposes. He asked questions about things that genuinely puzzled him, expressed preferences when choices needed to be made, and shared observations that often revealed insights the adults had missed entirely. Why do people say, "How are you?" when they don't wait for answers? He had asked Isabella one morning, demonstrating his keen observation of social conventions that didn't align with logical communication patterns. "The clock in the dining room sounds different today," he had mentioned to Marcus, leading to the discovery that the antique timepiece needed professional maintenance that might have gone unnoticed for months without his acute attention to environmental details. "Mrs. Patterson seems worried about something," he had observed accurately, prompting a conversation that revealed the housekeeper's concern about her aging mother's health, something she had been trying to handle alone rather than burden the household with her personal anxieties. These communications showed not just his growing comfort with verbal expression, but his deep attunement to the emotional undercurrents around him. James had always been observant, but now he could share his perceptions in ways that benefited everyone, contributing to the household's well-being rather than simply absorbing its dynamics passively. The most significant change, however, was in the relationship between father and son. Marcus had learned to communicate in James's preferred style, economical with words, rich in presence, comfortable with silence when silence served better than speech. Their evening puzzle sessions had evolved into complex collaborative projects that could span several days, with James providing visual analysis and Marcus contributing strategic planning, both of them finding deep satisfaction in their complementary approaches to problem-solving. These weren't just puzzles anymore, but architectural challenges, mathematical explorations, artistic endeavors that allowed both of them to express aspects of their personalities that had been dormant during the years of separation and misunderstanding. James would point out pattern relationships that Marcus had missed, while Marcus would suggest organizational strategies that helped James manage complex, multi-step processes. "This section needs the bridge pieces first," James might say, his language still economical, but his meaning perfectly clear. "Good thinking," Marcus would reply, genuinely impressed by his son's strategic analysis. "Should we sort by edge patterns or color families?" "Color first, then edges," James would decide, and they would work together in companionable concentration, two minds approaching the same challenge from different angles, but arriving at shared solutions. The transformation extended beyond their home into James's educational experience as well. His school had initially been skeptical when Marcus reported that James had begun speaking, but the evidence was undeniable when he arrived for his first day back and greeted his teacher with a clear, "Good morning, Miss Chen." His academic performance, which had always been strong in areas that didn't require verbal demonstration, now expanded to include active participation in discussions, verbal responses to questions, and even occasional contributions to group activities. He remained quiet compared to his more gregarious classmates, but his words carried weight when he chose to use them, and both teachers and students began to recognize that his careful observations often contained insights worth hearing. "The story doesn't make sense," he had said during a literature discussion, then explained with precision why the character's motivations seemed inconsistent with the plot development. His analysis was sophisticated enough to surprise his teacher and demonstrate that his comprehension had always exceeded what his silence had suggested. "This math problem has two different answers," he had observed during a lesson, leading to the discovery that the textbook contained an error that had gone unnoticed by previous classes. His attention to detail and logical reasoning made him a valuable contributor to classroom learning, not despite his differences, but because of the unique perspectives those differences provided. But perhaps the most profound change was in James's emotional expression. He had always felt deeply, but now he could share those feelings in ways that deepened his connections with others. When Isabella mentioned missing her grandmother, James had said simply, "Sad for Isabella," and leaned against her in the kind of spontaneous gesture of comfort that spoke volumes about his empathy and growing emotional intelligence. When Marcus had to travel for business, something that had previously been managed through careful scheduling and minimal disruption to routine, James was able to express both his understanding and his feelings about the separation. "Dad comes back Tuesday," he would say, demonstrating his grasp of time and sequence. "Miss Dad when he's gone," he added, acknowledging his emotions without being overwhelmed by them. These simple statements allowed Marcus to address James's feelings directly, to provide reassurance and maintain connection even across distance, to transform business travel from a source of anxiety into an opportunity for demonstrating the reliability of their bond. The household staff had adapted beautifully to James's emerging communication style. Mrs. Patterson had learned to engage him in brief but meaningful conversations about daily routines, appreciating both his practical contributions and his considerate nature. "Menu planning today, James," she might announce. "Any special requests?" "Fish is good," he might reply, or "No mushrooms, please," participating in household decisions while respecting the complexity of meal preparation for multiple people with different preferences. Thomas, the estate manager, had discovered that James's attention to detail made him an excellent partner for organizing and maintaining household systems. James could spot inefficiencies or problems that escaped adult notice, and his suggestions, though delivered in few words, often led to genuine improvements in how their home operated. Garden sprinkler broken, James had mentioned one morning, leading to the discovery of a malfunction that could have caused significant landscape damage if left unaddressed. Mail delivery different person, he had observed, alerting them to a change in postal service that might have security implications for a high-profile household like theirs. These contributions made James feel valued as a participating member of their household, rather than simply someone whose needs required accommodation. His unique perspective and careful observations benefited everyone, creating a sense of mutual support that strengthened their family bonds. The most touching development had been James's growing relationship with Marcus's extended family. His Aunt Rachel and her children had initially struggled to adapt to his communication style, but Isabella had helped them understand that James's few words carried the same emotional weight as their more extensive conversations. "Uncle James is the smartest person I know," his cousin Emma had declared, after James helped her solve a particularly challenging homework problem using visual strategies she had never considered. "He doesn't need to talk a lot, because he says exactly the right things," his cousin David had observed, with the kind of intuitive understanding that children often demonstrate more readily than adults. These relationships had given James practice in communicating with people outside his immediate household, expanding his comfort zone while reinforcing his sense of belonging within a larger family network. Rachel had learned to include him in family discussions by asking direct questions that required specific rather than elaborate responses, and James had begun volunteering observations and opinions that showed his engagement with family dynamics and decisions. The extended family gatherings that had once been sources of anxiety for everyone involved had transformed into occasions that James actually anticipated with pleasure. He had specific roles in their holiday preparations, contributed to gift selection based on his keen observations of what people actually needed or wanted, and even initiated some family traditions that accommodated his preferences while adding richness to their shared experiences. Marcus had documented this transformation carefully, not for medical purposes but for personal memory, creating photo albums and video recordings that captured the subtle changes in James's demeanor, the increasing frequency of his verbal communications, the growing ease of their interactions. These records served as reminders of how far they had all traveled from those early days of silence and misunderstanding. But the documentation also revealed something else: Isabella's central role in facilitating these changes. She appeared in countless photographs and videos, not as background staff, but as an integral family member whose presence had enabled transformations that went far beyond James's speech development. Her calm consistency had provided the stability that allowed James to take risks with communication. Her intuitive understanding of his non-verbal cues had built the bridge between his internal world and external expression. Her respect for his differences had created the safety necessary for him to share more of himself with others. The realization led to a conversation between Marcus and Isabella that had been building for months but had never been directly addressed. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, while James was in his room, engaged in one of his elaborate building projects that could occupy him for hours in peaceful concentration. "I need to ask you something important," Marcus said, finding Isabella in the kitchen where she was preparing ingredients for the evening meal, a task that had somehow evolved from necessity into a shared family ritual. Isabella looked up from her work, immediately attentive to the serious tone in his voice. "Of course, Marcus. What's on your mind?" "This family doesn't work without you," he said directly, characteristically avoiding elaborate preambles in favor of clear communication. "James doesn't work without you. I don't work without you. We've become something we never could have been separately." Isabella's hands stilled in their work, and she met his gaze steadily. "This job has become more than I ever expected to," she admitted. "James isn't just the child I care for professionally. You're not just my employer. This feels like family, Marcus finished. It feels like family because that's what we've become. The acknowledgement hung between them, carrying implications that went far beyond employment relationships or professional boundaries. They had created something unprecedented in Marcus's experience, a chosen family structure that honored everyone's needs and contributions, while providing the stability and love that James required to flourish. I have a proposition, Marcus continued. I want to make this official. Not just the job security, though, that's part of it. I want you to be James's legal guardian if anything ever happens to me. I want your name on his school records as family. I want you to have the authority to make decisions about his care and education. I want us to be a family in every way that matters. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but her expression was thoughtful rather than simply emotional. This wasn't a decision to be made lightly or in the heat of gratitude. It would mean permanent commitment to James's well-being, legal responsibility for his future, acceptance of the challenges as well as the joys that came with loving a child with unique needs. James should have a say in this, she said finally. This affects him more than anyone else. Marcus nodded, appreciating her wisdom in recognizing that James, despite his communication style, was capable of understanding and expressing preferences about major life decisions. They agreed to discuss the possibility with him that evening after dinner, when he was typically at his most relaxed and communicative. The conversation took place in the family room. All three of them settled comfortably on the large sectional sofa that had become their informal meeting place for important discussions. James was arranging colored blocks in complex patterns while listening to their words, his hands busy, but his attention clearly focused on the adults. "James, we want to talk to you about something important," Marcus began. "About our family and how we want it to stay together always." James looked up from his blocks, his expression serious but not anxious. He had learned to trust that important conversations in their household meant positive changes rather than unwelcome disruptions. "Isabella takes care of us," Marcus continued. "She helps us understand each other, helps our house feel like a real home. We want her to be part of our family officially, legally, permanently." James considered this information carefully, his gaze moving between Marcus and Isabella as he processed the implications. After a long moment, he spoke with characteristic directness. "Isabella is family already," he said simply. "Make it official, yes." The endorsement was delivered without drama or elaborate explanation, but its certainty left no room for doubt. James had recognized what the adults were still struggling to articulate, that their household had evolved into a family structure that worked beautifully for all of them, and that formalizing it would simply acknowledge what already existed. Isabella reached out and squeezed James's hand gently. "Are you sure? This would mean I'd be part of your family forever, through all kinds of changes and challenges." "Forever is good," James replied, then added with a small smile, "Isabella stays forever." The legal processes that followed were complex but manageable, requiring extensive documentation and multiple court appearances to establish Isabella's guardianship rights and formal family status. James participated in age-appropriate ways, meeting with social workers and family court officials who needed to verify that the arrangement served his best interests. His interactions with these professionals provided additional evidence of his remarkable development. He answered questions clearly and thoughtfully, expressed his preferences without hesitation, and demonstrated the kind of secure attachment that child welfare experts recognize as indicative of healthy family relationships. "I live with Dad and Isabella," he explained to one interviewer. "They take care of me. I take care of them too." "How do you take care of them?" the social worker asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Help with problems, notice things, make them happy," James replied, his economy of language masking the sophistication of his understanding about mutual care and family responsibility. The legal formalization was completed on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with all three family members present in the courthouse for the final signatures and official declarations. James wore his best clothes and carried himself with the kind of dignity that suggested he understood the significance of the occasion. When the judge announced that Isabella Martinez was now legally recognized as James Richardson's guardian and family member, James stood up spontaneously and said clearly, "Thank you, Judge Wilson." The unexpected formality of his response drew smiles from everyone present, but it also demonstrated his awareness that other people had played important roles in making their family structure possible. His gratitude extended beyond his immediate household to include the broader community that had supported their unconventional but successful arrangement. The celebration that followed was characteristically quiet but deeply meaningful. They returned home to a dinner that Mrs. Patterson had prepared with special care, featuring James's favorite foods arranged with the kind of attention to visual presentation that he particularly appreciated. "Today we made it official," Marcus said during their meal. "But really, we were already a family. We just wanted everyone else to recognize what we already knew." "Good families don't just happen," Isabella added. "They're built by people who choose to take care of each other day after day through all kinds of circumstances." James nodded thoughtfully, then made a statement that surprised them both with its emotional maturity. "Before Isabella, house was quiet but not peaceful," he said. "Now quiet is peaceful. Happy quiet." The distinction was profound, highlighting the difference between silence that comes from isolation and silence that comes from contentment. Their home had found its natural rhythm, one that honored James's need for calm while providing rich opportunities for connection and growth. As the months continued to pass, the Richardson family developed traditions and routines that reflected their unique composition and values. Sunday morning puzzle projects became sacred family time, with increasingly complex challenges that required all three of them to contribute their different strengths. Evening reading sessions evolved into discussions where James's observations often provided fresh perspectives on familiar stories. Holiday celebrations were reimagined to accommodate James's sensory needs while maintaining the joy and connection that make such occasions memorable. They discovered that smaller gatherings, with careful attention to environment and pacing, created more meaningful experiences than large, overwhelming events. James's birthday parties became celebrations of his interests and achievements rather than typical child-focused events. His 8th birthday featured a puzzle-making workshop where he and his friends created custom jigsaw puzzles from their own artwork, combining his love of visual organization with creative expression and social interaction. The transformation extended to Marcus's professional life as well. His experience with James had given him insights into neurodiversity and alternative communication styles that proved valuable in business contexts. He began noticing employees who might have valuable contributions that weren't being recognized through traditional evaluation methods. Richardson Global became known for its inclusive hiring practices and innovative approaches to team communication, changes that improved both company culture and bottom-line results. Marcus's personal growth had professional applications that he hadn't anticipated, creating positive ripple effects far beyond his immediate family. But the most significant measure of their success was James himself, who continued to grow in confidence and capability while remaining fundamentally true to his authentic self. He never became a typical chatty child, never lost his preference for order and routine, never stopped seeing the world through his unique perceptual lens. Instead, he became more fully himself, more comfortable with his differences, more skilled at communicating his needs and perspectives, more connected to the people who mattered to him. His autism remained an integral part of who he was, but it no longer felt like a barrier to love and connection and belonging. On a warm evening in late summer, as their second year as an official family was drawing to a close, the three of them sat on the back terrace watching fireflies dance across the garden. James was nestled between Marcus and Isabella, comfortable and relaxed, occasionally pointing out particularly bright flashes of light. "This is perfect," Isabella said softly, expressing what they were all feeling. "Perfect for us," James corrected gently, demonstrating his understanding that their family structure might not work for everyone, but was exactly right for them. Marcus wrapped his arms around both of them, marveling at how different his life had become from what he had imagined. He had started with a silent son and desperate hope for expert solutions. He had ended up with a speaking son, a chosen family, and the deep satisfaction of relationships built on understanding rather than trying to fix what wasn't actually broken. "I love our family," he said, the words carrying the weight of journey and discovery and gratitude. "Love our family too," James replied, his voice carrying across the warm evening air with quiet certainty. Isabella smiled, watching the fireflies continue their ancient dance, thinking about all the different ways that light could appear in the darkness, all the different languages that love could speak, all the different forms that families could take when built with patience and wisdom, and the courage to see people as they truly are, rather than as they're supposed to be. Their story hadn't followed any of the traditional narratives about overcoming disabilities or medical miracles or expert interventions. Instead, it had been about recognition, acceptance, and the transformative power of being truly seen and understood by people who choose to stay, to learn, to grow together through all the challenges and discoveries that real love requires. The silence that had once felt like a prison had become a foundation for something richer and more complex than conventional conversation could provide. James's first word had been help, but his family had learned that the deepest help often comes not from trying to change people, but from creating conditions where they can flourish exactly as they are. As the evening deepened and the fireflies gradually disappeared into the gathering darkness, the Richardson family remained on their terrace, comfortable in each other's presence, comfortable in the quiet that connected them, comfortable in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and lasting and real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.